why did you pointed Argentina as one of the countries that managed the best the COVID-19?
Well, I mean, to be clear, if I was just doing a top 5 or top 10 list of all countries around the world, Argentina probably wouldn't have made it. But I didn't do it that way. What I said is, let's look at different categories. Let's look at frontline states that are right next to China that were experiencing a lot of early caseload. Let's look at G7 economies, compare the biggest economies in the world. Let's look at tiny states, right, which obviously much easier to respond if you're really small. And then let's look at some countries that are really challenged, that have a much harder time, whose economics are really difficult. And there, Greece and Argentina, that's a fair comparison. I mean, Argentina doesn't have the resources to respond the way South Korea or Germany does. But, you know, frankly, among economies that are in a lot of trouble right now, that, you know, frankly, before coronavirus, when you talked about Argentina, all you talked about was default and economic implosion and superinflation and everything, and the IMF. Actually, when you look at Argentina and coronavirus, the response has been surprisingly strong on a number of fronts, and I think that's deserving of calling out. So, you know, for me, you know, I was looking at who gets the gold and the silver medals among the poorer countries out there, the countries that are more economically challenged, and there I think Argentina deserves to be called out.
You underlined specifically the fact that the bipartisan cooperation led to consistent decisions. What was the gesture or the measure that brought this to your mind?
Well, I mean, first, the fact that almost the entire political class in Argentina came together around President Fernandez's plan to respond to coronavirus. All the governors were on board with strict lockdowns. This is not what you're seeing in the United States. It's certainly not what you're seeing in Brazil, where there's a holy fight going on between the president and the governors every day. In Argentina, actually, the government was all rowing in the same direction. In a crisis, that's what you need. You don't need cheerleading. You don't need polemics. You don't need my team versus your team. You need the country together. And I think that that is one of the reasons why the general population in Argentina has responded pretty well. I mean, Fernandez's approval ratings went up to 70, 80% in the country on the back of a really, really tough time where, you know, here in my own United States, Trump's maximum was maybe 46. Now he's back down around 40, 41 again. Not much of a bump because the country remains so divided.
When you talk about experiences of division during the pandemic, what was the worst thing you've seen? I mean, obviously Trump and Bolsonaro are the bad examples, but specifically between different levels of state, what clashes do you think are the worst to have in
Well, so let's talk about, again, different types of problems. In China, you had for the first month a complete lockdown on information. They covered up the pandemic. They didn't work with the World Health Organization, wouldn't provide transparent information, not even to their own people. And that meant that we had weeks where millions of Chinese were traveling across the country from Wuhan. Hundreds of thousands were leaving the country from Wuhan. That's how we got the pandemic. So, I mean, I think that mismanagement, we can't forget, even though that once they started becoming transparent, they could really crack down. They could, you know, sort of bend the curve. They could, you know, get the quarantines done. They could restart the economy. But that first month was devastating for China and for the rest of the world. So we can't forget about that. Then we can look at some other countries around the world that have made some really big mistakes. Iran, the way they lied to their people. I mean, here's a country under a lot of economic challenge, under a lot of constraints, and they had this big problem, of course, the Americans killing Soleimani, and then they knocked down their own Iranian civilian aircraft and lied about that to their people for a few days. Same thing. They said, don't worry about it. We don't need lockdowns in our holy city of Qom. There aren't many cases. Then we see that literally cabinet officials in Iran are getting sick. They're obviously sick. They're giving press conferences, and it goes through the Iranian parliament. This becomes a disaster. And they, you know, they deal with it too late. far more people die than they're willing to admit. They now have a major second explosion of cases. You look at a country like Pakistan, where the prime minister has been Imran Khan has been really late to the game in terms of closing down the mosques, for example. It's led to much greater spread. He doesn't have the money to ensure that the economy can stay open. And so as a consequence, he says, you know what, we're just going to have to live with the virus. And the military is increasingly stepping in to limit the prime minister's own democratic influence over power because he's so mismanaged. This could affect the future of the government. Then, of course, we mentioned countries like you said, my own United States and Brazil. Brazil's done much worse than the United States. The U.S., the president is a cheerleader and he's very divisive. But the U.S. response is not just about the president. The Fed response has been very strong. The economic response from Congress so far has been very strong. And various states in the U.S., it's very federal, it's very decentralized. Some have done a good job, some have done a bad job. We were bad on testing, we were late, and we were bad on some of the lockdowns in some of the key cities, and especially around older folks' homes, where in my own New York, you let people older with coronavirus come back to those homes, led to 40% of the deaths. In Brazil, it's much worse. Yeah. Because in Brazil, you've got fake news coming directly from the president. You've got a massive political fight between the president and the governors, between the president and the Supreme Court. You've got two health ministers that have resigned as a consequence. Brazil is really, really the bottom of the barrel in terms of democratically elected government.
As regards Argentina, you said with our decision, or with the government decision of putting health over economy and adopting an early quarantine a few days after we got the first cases, yep. You said it was the best decision between bad alternatives.
Sure.
Why do you think Argentina had only bad alternatives? Because of the crisis? Because of budget?
So little money. I mean, the government did launch a program to help companies pay wages, transfers to poor and informal workers to help mitigate the social and the economic impact of the pandemic. I mean, those are important things to do, but the ability of the Argentine government to make significant efforts to provide relief for Argentine workers, to bail out Argentine corporations in this environment, I mean, massively constrained. So, you don't want to be in a position like Argentina, facing credit downgrades, facing default, can't get to the credit markets. And then suddenly you've got a pandemic, which is going to lead to a massive economic contraction globally and kill a lot of people. So, I mean, given all of that, and, test levels in Argentina also, not the best in the world, certainly, but better per capita than a lot of countries in Latin America. I mean, right now, you're doing better than Peru, you're doing better than Mexico, worse than Chile, certainly, but Chile is always the outstanding performer in South America. The number of deaths so far, the number of cases in Argentina, I mean, your curve looks a lot more like Israel than it looks like Peru or Brazil or even Chile. And I think that matters an awful lot. Again, not many people focus on Argentina as succeeding in response to coronavirus because the Argentine news headlines have all been about the economic collapse, right? And how you're going to respond to all of these creditors that are demanding their pound of flesh. But actually, the biggest story of the past 6 months has not been economic. It's been primarily the pandemic. And on that front, the Argentine government has done a pretty good job.
Dr. Bremmer, you always talk to people in high funds and companies. You're asked for opinion on Argentina by the big creator funds sometimes. Do you think Fernandez's government is approaching kind of Venezuelan rule or government?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, as you know, that there's been talk about potential nationalization of this big agricultural company that, is facing bankruptcy. There's been a lot of debate about how you handle that in the parliament. There's been a lot of pushback. That's very different from talking about Venezuela. Venezuela is not in any way a democracy. Venezuela is a country that has been taken over by a dictator with the support of the military against the Venezuelan people. It should be one of the wealthiest countries in South America. It has massive energy resources, and all of the talent has left. The international sanctions regime is massively destructive, and the country's infrastructure has completely fallen apart. I mean, you cannot compare what's happening in Venezuela, which has become a pariah state, a rogue state on the international map, not just with the Trump administration, with pretty much everyone. The only people supporting Venezuela right now, the Cubans, the Russians, the Chinese, Iran. This is not where you want to be. Argentina is a real country. And, you're negotiating with the IMF right now, you're negotiating with the creditors, and hopefully we'll end up in a better place.
Do you think this is an extended idea in the U.S. political system and the entrepreneurship establishment, for example?
Argentina has a very spotty track record in terms of economic management. And certainly when you talk about not Fernandez per se, but Cristina Kirchner, she is considered at best volatile and unorthodox, and at worst actively destabilizing by most in the American foreign policy establishment. Left and right of center doesn't really matter. But that's very different. A lot of people don't like President Trump, and they think he's volatile, and they think he's got an authoritarian personality. But the United States is a democracy, and the United States is a superpower. You still work with the United States. You still want to send your kids to school in the United States. So it has a lot more to do with the structure of the system and the institutions. Argentina, the depressing thing about Argentina is if you go back to, 150 years ago, most Europeans thought that Argentina was going to be more successful than the United States. And there were a lot of bad decisions that were taken, a lot of state capitalist decisions made around agriculture, for example, that led Argentina to become a lot less efficient, a lot less productive. The United States, much more entrepreneurial, led to the U.S. Being much more successful in trajectory. And certainly, the business community, the CEO community in Argentina, and I know many of them, but you don't get the same sense of entrepreneurship, the same sense of industriousness, or the same sense of we need to change our government to be much more reformist than you get, for example, in Brazil or in Mexico. And I think that's hurt Argentina to a degree. Having said that, as someone who loves to go to Buenos Aires, it's one of the most attractive and culturally engaging, fun, cosmopolitan cities in the world, cultured, you name it. So, I have a bias. It would truly hurt me for Argentina to fall apart. I don't want to see that happen.
It was until 90 days ago. And luckily,
no, the shutdown. I know the shutdowns have been tough. These are not New York style lockdowns. These are real lockdowns. They've been very severe, and I know the people in Argentina are getting tired, especially in BA, where most of the cases are being concentrated. Believe me. People in my city of New York, which has been the epicenter for a long time until very recently of the crisis, they're getting tired. And they want out, and they don't have any sense of what real lockdown is like. We can go to the parks, we can go outside, we can exercise. That has not been the case for you guys, and I do feel for you.
I had the chance during this pandemic to interview economists like Branko Milanovic or Thomas Piketty, with whom I've talked about inequalities or how this pandemic will affect them. I want to ask you how this rising inequalities can affect the political stability in countries and between countries. Do you think there can be a civil war anywhere after this, or a war between countries, or a big economic crisis, and how, for example, Milanovic states social disaggregation?
Well, we are seeing social disaggregation. One of the reasons that the Black Lives Matter movement has exploded is because there are so many young Black people that are now unemployed on the back of coronavirus, on top of what was already an unacceptable level of social and racial inequality in the United States. And more of them are dying and getting sick from coronavirus, and more of them have jobs that can't effectively socially distance. I mean, you can understand the level of anger in this environment. Now, that's not civil war. It's not close to civil war. What it is a lot more Americans who are going to be uninterested in open markets, in free trade, in America as the policeman for other countries. You're going to see more unilateralism, more focus at home. You see Peter Navarro saying, I want $2 trillion and I want to bring jobs back, manufacturing jobs back, capital back to the United States. A lot of countries with great inequality, where the taxpayers are bailing out companies around the world, are going to focus more on production at home, jobs at home, food at home, don't export as much, that kind of thing. There will be some countries that implode. I mean, Lebanon might not be a democracy when we're through with this. Their financial situation is disastrous. Their government is very weak. The Gulf states are under their own pressures because of low energy prices. They're not going to provide as much money. You could see a number of weaker emerging markets under massive stress, not getting the support from the IMF or from the international credit markets that they need, that could actually implode in this environment. And you could definitely have real unrest in those countries as a consequence. That's not the US, it's not Europe, it's not Japan, it's not Australia, it's not any of the advanced industrial economies. But the indifference of the advanced industrial economies to what happens in the poorer countries, that is going to go up at a time when many in the wealthy countries are saying, you're not taking care of me. Why do I care about these other guys? Right? I mean, it's Maslow's hierarchy. I care a lot more about globalization, global poverty, when I feel like my family is taken care of, my neighborhood's taken care of. You don't do that, I'm voting for Trump. I'm voting for Bernie Sanders. Both Trump and Bernie Sanders on foreign policy, not so supremely different, really oppose American exceptionalism and all these ideas of America being the North Star for the rest of the world.
And what about the conflict in our countries, in Latin America, in East Asia? I mean, what can arise upon these inequalities strengthened because of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, East Asia, Southeast Asia has done some of the best jobs in responding to the coronavirus crisis, certainly in terms of contact tracing. The fact that they had experienced many pandemics in the recent past and learned from MERS, from SARS, countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. I mean, some are wealthy, some are poor, but their responses have been very effective because they had that playbook. Like the United States, our Fed was very effective. The European Central Bank's very effective. Why? Because they remember 2008 to 2010. They had that playbook. We ripped up our pandemic playbook, but we remembered the Fed playbook, the economic crisis playbook. They still had that. So I'm less worried about near-term structural inequality on the back of coronavirus in East and Southeast Asia. Long-term, different question. Latin America, where we've got the epicenter of the coronavirus right now, this is going to cause a lot more inequality. And then longer term, you're going to have the middle classes that had done so well in the past decades are going to lose a lot of jobs, because you'll see a lot more automation. You'll see a lot more big data and deep learning taking away even white-collar jobs from people that aren't the most skilled in this environment. Remember, the last 50 years, we did really well in the world, in part because there was a global middle class that was able, through relatively cheap and talented labor, to become much more productive and attract a lot more capital. Now we see globalization starting to unwind. We see a lot more money driven towards your domestic labor, and we see a lot more focus on efficiency away from labor that's gotten more expensive and moving towards automation. That's sped up by the coronavirus crisis. That's going to create much greater instability among the middle income emerging markets.
Brazil was one of the top performers during that boom you mentioned. Yeah. Can it be a place of disaster after this? I mean, politically, more than in terms of health? I mean, politically, but can Brazil a non-democracy, for example?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you've seen in the FT and the New York Times all these articles saying that Bolsonaro is going to create a military coup, and obviously his language is horrible around this stuff. He says things that are brutally stupid and incredibly divisive. But, and he has a lot of former military types in his cabinet. But the actual military in Brazil has no interest in that. Very similar to the United States. I mean, Trump can say whatever he wants, but he can't actually tell the military, you act against the Constitution. In fact, they uphold the Constitution. And the Brazilian military, the top brass, is the same way. So I think, we should give Brazilian institutions more credit. We should give their Supreme Court more credit. I mean, maybe they'll tread a little more carefully because they don't want to necessarily have a ruling that Bolsonaro refuses to follow, and then it goes into the Congress and they have to rule on it. Maybe there'll be maybe the institutional control of the Supreme Court will decline a bit. Certainly now that Mora is no longer a judicial minister, he was very respected as a former justice. Now that he's left, that definitely erodes the quality of legitimacy of the Bolsonaro administration. But look, I honestly believe that either Bolsonaro will be impeached, which is low likelihood, or we'll go forward and we're going to have an election in 2022, and it'll be a democratic election. And, Bolsonaro will have his social media followers, but he's lost a lot of approval recently because he's mismanaged things so badly. And I wouldn't bet on him to win re-election right now. And that's what you think of. I mean, I bet on Putin to win re-election for the rest of his life, right? I bet on authoritarian leaders that pretend to have democracy when they pretend to have elections. But in Brazil, they're not pretending to be a democracy. They are a democracy. They have a leader that would maybe like to be an authoritarian leader, but it's too bad because they actually have a democracy. My own country is very similar. I'm not really worried about democratic institutions there.
That'll do, Ian. Thank you very, very much for your time. It was very interesting.